What's going on, everyone? Dudette with Dudette Gaming, back with another Predecessor video. Today we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the mid lane role and giving you some essential tips to make you a better mage on the battlefield. So let's get into it. The mid lane role is one of the essential roles in Predecessor that must be fulfilled correctly. As the mid laner, you're going to want to typically play as a caster or mage style hero, one who focuses on ability damage and magical damage, opposed to physical and basics. The caster is typically built with AoE and even some crowd control built into their kits. For this reason, it is absolutely essential that you are present for every team fight and for every objective taking. If you are, it may be the difference between a win and a loss. The mid lane role is what I like to call the 360-degree role. I call it that because you have both 360 degrees of advantage but also disadvantage throughout the game. But we'll get into that a little more later. So I want to break down a tiny bit more of what the mid lane role is and give you guys a few tips along the way. So let's start by looking at your attacks. Like I said, you're going to be focusing on your abilities opposed to your basic attack. Your abilities are going to be what makes you shine. Casters are built with AoE style attacks, and they're also built with crowd control in a lot of the caster kits. For this reason, it is utterly essential that you are present for as many team fights as possible and for all of the objective taking if possible. Your AoE attacks are what are going to make you shine. AoE meaning area of effect. You can damage multiple heroes at once. Opposed to focusing on one single hero, you can help your team in a team fight by damaging multiple heroes. So my first tip along the way is when you engage in a fight, remember you can damage multiple enemies at once. A lot of people end up focusing on one single hero instead of the groups of heroes that are easier to do more damage across. So a big thing you can do in most situations is try to attack the crowds. Now, the second small tip that I want to leave along the way is crowd control. Like I said, most casters have crowd control built into their kits. For that reason, you will be very effective in team fights, or at least you'll be able to help your team get ahead in team fights if you use your abilities correctly. Let's look at Faye for a second. Faye has an incredible kit for crowd control and AoE damage. Almost all of her abilities do AoE, and almost all of her abilities do crowd control. Her line attack slows enemies and damages enemies, which can also be multiple. Her seed damages multiple enemies, and her ultimate ability will actually pull all of the enemies that were in the cone into the center of it and stun them for a second. Most casters in the game, like I said, have AoE and crowd control built in. Use that to your advantage. If you can damage multiple enemies every time you launch an ability, you will get a huge advantage in the team fights. And if you can use your crowd control effectively, you will also help your team get ahead by controlling the enemy. Let's use Gideon for this next one. If your team is, let's say, in the Raptor pit, and the enemy team comes and they start to engage in a fight and maybe try to take Raptors, you can use your ultimate ability to actually pull the enemies in closer and do large damage to them over time. And it slows the enemy. This gives your team a huge advantage because it can help them solo out certain heroes that are getting ahead, and it can help you do massive damage to a lot of the enemies. Something you need to remember about casters is not all of them have escapes built in, so you do need to be careful how far into a fight you get. On top of that, you don't typically build tanky, so you're not going to be very strong. You're going to be more like a glass cannon a little bit. So you need to remember when you're in team fights not to get in the center of it unless if you have a good way of getting out or protecting yourself. So you want to do damage from the outskirts of the battle without being ready to run away at all times, which is another thing a lot of people have a hard time with, is just wanting to run away the second things get tough. Now I want to look a little bit into the next tip here, which is going to be your build. Now your build is going to focus a little bit on what we just talked about, your AoE and your crowd control. Like I said at the beginning, you're going to be doing magical damage, and so you want to be building magical damage and magical penetration. Another big thing that you really want to remember to build is mana, because you're going to be very mana hungry because your basics aren't going to do you hardly any good at all. And you also want to build cooldowns. If you can have magical damage, magical penetration, cooldown, you will absolutely be dominant, especially if you can farm properly and get ahead. And remember to build in your kit things that are going to give you an advantage. I'll always suggest active builds throughout a game. What I mean by active builds is as the game progresses, you change your build if necessary, or you adapt your build to the specific game you're playing, especially if your team is not necessarily winning. In other words, building anti-heal for enemies that are having a lot of lifesteal, or building more penetration if the enemy team is really tanky. There's all kinds of things that you can build that are going to help your team. So always remember to look at the scoreboard so you can see what your enemy is building, so you can counter build them and get ahead. Okay, so we're going to go back to that beginning part again a little bit. And this is going to be focused on your crowd control just a little bit more. And this is going to be the third tip for the video, which is take control of team fights. A huge advantage to a good mid laner is that they can take control of a team fight. Not only do you do AoE and have crowd control, but you're also able to give your team the advantage that they need. Oftentimes, if a team is falling behind, so let's say for example that your carry has died in a team fight and it's now a 5v4, one thing you can do is use your abilities and your crowd control to focus on the enemy heroes that are getting ahead. If you can focus on the enemy heroes that are getting ahead, you'll slow them down and potentially help your team kill them. And when you take out the top players on the enemy team, their team is now at a large disadvantage. So now you can move on and focus on the other enemy heroes that are in range. Another thing you can do with your abilities is help your teammates that are struggling in the team fights. So let's look again at that carry. If your carry is getting close to death, but you have the ability to potentially save them, use your abilities. Save the ones that are going to help your team for the right time and use them to assist your carry. One thing you need to remember, and we'll talk about this a little more later, is that your abilities are going to have, especially early mid game, very big cooldowns. So when you do engage in team fights and you want to go and take control of the team fight, you need to be wise about how you use your abilities. Because if you pop your most powerful ability or your ultimate ability, you might not have it by the time the team fight's over again. So you need to make sure that you're being wise about when you're using abilities and how. Don't just fly in and throw out all of your abilities, hoping that they do damage and hoping that they hit your target. Be wise and thoughtful, and you will be able to help your team take control of the team fights. Okay, so we're going to go into my last two parts here. The one is going back to what I said about us being the 360-degree role. The mid lane both comes with a huge advantage and a disadvantage. As the 360-degree role, you need to remember that you have a very high mobility rate. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that your specific hero is faster than the others, although you may be able to get that way. What it means is that you are centered right in the middle of the map, meaning that you are able to get to the objectives and to the other lanes quicker than most of the other lanes. For example, if the duo lane needs help and your off lane wants to come help, he has to traverse the entire map to get there. And by the time he is there, the team fight's probably over. So you, being the mid laner, have half of the time that it takes to get over to whatever lane or to whatever objective needs help. This puts a lot of responsibility on you because your team might be fighting next to you in the jungle. And if you're not paying attention, they may end up losing a fight that they easily could have won with your help. So you need to remember that your role comes with a little bit of responsibility. It's also an advantage because you're able to see whenever the enemy team is moving from one side of the map to the other. For example, if the jungle crosses over your lane from the right to the left, you can now communicate with your whoever it is on your left side. You can communicate with them and tell them that, hey, the jungler has moved over, or the duo lane is coming towards the off lane, or towards or prime, or whatever it is. You have a great responsibility with communication as well. So remember that with your 360-degree role. Now, this also gives you, like I said, big advantages, but also comes with some pretty big disadvantages. The disadvantage is that the enemy can, realistically speaking, gank you on all sides. Besides through your tower, which they may be able to later in the game, but in a typical scenario, both your left and your right side are going to be fully exposed. And it's even worse if you're in a bad position within the lane. If you're in a bad position in the lane and the enemy jungler comes for you and you don't have your escape, there's a good chance that you're going to die because you're not tanky and you're not typically going to be good at 1v1s, especially early on in the game. So with that 360-degree roll also means that you need to be paying attention to the game. You need to be paying attention to what's going on, listening to the cues from your team. Say if the dual lane is missing and you're in the middle of your map or you're pushing the enemy tower, you should probably wise up and back off a bit because they're probably coming your way because you're an easy kill. All right, let's look at our final tip, and that's going to be my caution to you of 1v1s. Now, mid laners do a lot of ability damage, as we've been over, and they have some pretty good crowd control. However, in a typical scenario, they don't shine in 1v1 situations. For this reason, you need to be careful of your positioning on the map and be cautious of 1v1s. Now, I'm not saying that you can never do a 1v1. In fact, there are a lot of good mid lane players who can do that even against a jungle or a carry and win the fight. But you are at a giant disadvantage if you miss your abilities. Even if you miss only one of your abilities, if your other abilities can't kill whoever it is you're fighting and you've missed those, there's a good chance that you're not going to win the fight because a lot of other heroes are focused on their basic attacks, which they can do a lot more consistently than you can do your abilities. So like I said, I'm not telling you to never get in those fights, but you need to make sure if you're going to go in and engage in a 1v1 that you are ready to land your abilities. Otherwise, you may well end up losing that fight. Okay guys, that's going to do it for the video. I hope that this has been some good information. I hope that you've learned a little more about mid lane and picked up some good tips along the way. And feel free to leave me a like and a subscribe and a comment on any videos that you're wanting to see or any suggestions that you have. Anyways, that's going to do it. Hope to see you guys in the battlefield. Peace.